After a very long and arduous journey, our train eventually arrived in Calcutta about 3 o'clock in the morning. And surprise, surprise, no one was expecting us because there was nothing laid on, no reception, no transport to take us to the camp or anything. So as usual, we were bereft of advice and we curled up on the platform floor in order to have a bit of a kip and a wait to see what was happening. And eventually, a long time, an hour and a half later, some trucks did turn up, and eventually we embarked on the trucks and were taken along to the transit camp, and we arrived there. It would be then about 5:30 in the morning. And of course, as we said, no one was expecting us. They were quite surprised to find so many troops arriving at the camp without warning. And of course, they took us first, out of sympathy, I think, along to the sleeping quarters and advised us to lay down, have a rest, while they were going to rustle up some form of a breakfast for us, which was gratefully received, because you can appreciate to lay down on a bed horizontally after that terrible train journey was an absolute delight indeed. Well, after having such an enjoyable breakfast, a nice fry of bacon, eggs and sausage and etc., you know, the typical English breakfast, we were ready then to return back to our hut. But before we were allowed to leave, the colonel of the camp came in to do what I call his official welcome to everyone and related a strange story. He said, with some amusement, he said he'd made inquiries as to why we had arrived unannounced and unprepared. And the truth was, when he'd been in touch with the camp at Lake Beale in Doolally, they didn't know what had happened to us, because we were supposed to get on the train as we described, but only to be taken on a 1-hour journey back down to the Bombay docks in order to board the ship that was awaiting us to take us to Burma. But in fact, someone somehow instructed the engine driver to take us across the continent to Calcutta, and no one knew where we were lost, whatever, until we arrived in Calcutta eventually. So he said, you could have all gone home. We wouldn't have known where you were. But surprisingly, we're a bit far away to go home. But nevertheless, it was quite a strange story to have. And we all laughed at that as we went back to our hut and decided to clean up, have a nice shower, have another rest, and then we decided to have a walk into the city of Calcutta itself. We managed to hitch a lift using one of the transit camp's trucks to get a lift into the city itself. And it's about 6 miles out of Barrackpore to the center of the city. And despite the fact that the city was quite an impressive place, built under colonial rules at the time, but when we wandered around the bazaar areas near the riverside, we found it actually stunk to the high heaven. The whole city was stinking. And we even found that the lampposts had joss sticks, scented joss sticks fastened to the lampposts to try and kill off the smell. And I couldn't figure out why a city such as big as London almost stunk so much. But when we walked near the river edge, it was quite apparent that the river, which wasn't a fast-flowing river, was inundated with old ships, but mostly the population were using the river for self-sanitation, cleaning themselves, showering, washing clothes, etc. So clearly there was a good excuse for the smell that enveloped the city itself. But never mind, we wandered into the bazaar area, which I found quite attractive, and we had a good time wandering in the sunshine and a leisurely stroll around the city. As always, I would wander to the bazaar areas in order to see what we'd call the trinkets, because wherever troops were situated, there was always a good selection of bazaar stalls selling trinkets, embroidered silks, supposedly gold rings and bracelets. But I got myself hooked on the idea of looking and buying a kukri. Now that is a Gurkha army knife which they use in their battle. And believe me, I've always been fascinated by the Gurkha tradition, and the knife always held a place in my heart. So because of the problems of insurrection and the natives putting you at risk, I thought the idea of buying a kukri and wearing it predominantly would act as a safeguard to me when I was wandering the city walks, which I did.
Next is a shorter and lighter version of the GAK, Gurkha Army Kukuri. IMA and ACC, they call this a bushpoor, which is just a marketing term and incorrect also. This is the most common kukuri sold by IMA and ACC.
And I found a stall, as I say, where they had the kukris, and they demonstrated it by just taking the kukri up and putting a coin on the wall ledge and chopped the coin in half. I couldn't believe that a knife could cut a coin in half so cleanly. But the kukris are made of specially tempered steel and exceptionally sharp, so I was very pleased to get it and strap it on and wore it, actually, for the rest of my time out in the Far East. But nevertheless, we eventually had to make our way back to camp after spending a few hours there. And we didn't have a truck to take ourselves back. So we hired a trishaw. Now, trishaws, if you're not familiar with them, a trishaw is technically a rickshaw on a bike, a three-wheel bike. And we decided to have a trishaw to take us back to camp. But as always, in the playful mood we were in, there was about 6 of us in our little gang, and we hired a trishaw each. And they were quite confused because what we did was to put the owner of the trishaw in the back seat, and we got on to pedal, and we had a race all the way back to the camp, racing all the way. They must, again, thinking, bad dogs and Englishmen, how stupid, paying all that money and pedaling yourself all the way back to camp. But it was hilarious and enjoyable afternoon. It's perhaps appropriate to mention that we are in a transit camp, and the definition of the transit camp is simply a holding station in which to accommodate troops such as ourselves who were on the move and are waiting to be moved from one destination to another. So in the meantime, we had no duties to perform, or parades, etc. We were fortunate to have on site a small army cinema unit which would show films, usually films that we had seen years before, way back at home. And of course, they had a small swimming pool. Now, the swimming pool was very, how can I say, ordinary, nothing elaborate, but it was a pool of water in which we could soak ourselves and swim around and relax in the afternoon sun and cool off. But one of the things that we did manage to acquire was the services of what we would call the Indian traveling entertainers. And by that I mean they would come in and put on a show for us. There was the strong men, acrobatics, snake charmers, magicians. And most of all, the dancing girls. And of course, the dancing girls were always the most popular in the military camp. Very nice indeed. But nevertheless, we would be there for a few weeks until the authorities would seek out, in our case, a suitable ship to accommodate us and to transport us across the waters from Calcutta, across the Bay of Bengal, and to the capital of Burma, the city of Rangoon. Well, our so-called holiday at the camp came to an end in the fourth week of our stay there, because we were instructed to start packing up our bags and equipment, ready for a move off at the end of 4 weeks in our journey to Burma. It had been a good 4 weeks, spoiled a little only on one occasion when, as always, we had a riotous occasion in the city of Calcutta between the Hindus and Muslims fighting each other, and it was getting out of control. So we were obliged to be armed with rifle and bayonets, etc., and shipped down into the city to show a military presence, which worked, but we had to threaten to shoot, first over the heads, and if they didn't behave, to shoot into the bodies, which was a frightening prospect for me.
After the firemen, police reinforcements.
But it was an introduction to the kind of thing that no doubt we would be facing a number of times in our future. But nevertheless, the holiday as such came to an end. They had found a ship for us called the SS Rajula. Now, the ship wasn't a passenger ship, it was a freighter, and not a big one at that. So the idea of being transported on a freighter meant that we had to go below decks and sleep on hammocks. Well, I can't manage a hammock on the best of occasions, and nor could many others. But going below decks in the heat was quite horrendous, far too uncomfortable. So we decided that the best thing to do was to avoid the hammocks and take our blankets and pillow and sleep on deck in the shade if we could, which we did, as a matter of fact. But one of the peculiar things that I found is that every ship, of course, has a brass plate on its foredeck proclaiming its name, its tonnage, and its place where it was built. And would you believe it? It was actually built in South Shields at a small shipyard in which my great-grandfather actually worked as a night watchman. It was strange that to me to actually be on a ship from Shields, and it was going to take us across the waters to Burma. But nevertheless, as I say, the holiday and the experience came to an end, and we boarded the ship at the end of the 4th week, and we moved downstream, presuming, of course, that we were actually on our way, but we moved downstream and dropped anchor for reasons which we never understood, nor were we informed. All we had to do simply was to await overnight for some maritime regulations to be fulfilled, and the next morning we set sail at last on our journey across the waters to Burma and Rangoon.